And I'm very pleased to be here. My name's Tom Erickson. I'm from a company called Acquia. Nikhil mentioned it briefly a moment ago. We work with Drupal users around the globe. We have operations in, today, I think it's 6 countries, employees in 9 countries, and a couple of different missions. We're founded by the founder of Drupal, Dries, so a big part of our mission is to, really grow Drupal. And of course, we're trying to build a company as well alongside that to help that, support the ecosystem for Drupal. So I have a great opportunity to meet with a lot of different Drupal clients literally around the world, from organizations like the Figaro in France, the famous French newspaper, to this week I was with NVIDIA in California, who moving all of their sites over to Drupal. They've been in a variety of technologies. So today's talk really is going to be about what are some of these folks doing, and why are they doing it, at least from the perspective of what we're hearing from them. Hopefully it'll be useful for you, and I'll try to leave some time at the end. I forgot to check and see how much time I actually have. 45 minutes. And you can ask me any questions. I will say, though, that I am not the intended speaker here. I'm the substitute, so if it's not really up to what you were hoping for, that's my excuse. My colleague Tim Bertrand was scheduled to be here, and I'm the sub. He's in Europe with some of our businesses there. I'm especially excited to be here, though, because it was actually about 3.5 years ago that I came up with the idea of Drupal Business Summits, and not something probably anybody in the room knows. And I felt that DrupalCons were a great place for technical people to get together, but we needed a place where people could get together and talk about the business usage of Drupal from 2 perspectives. One, from the community itself, so that people involved in the community, people out talking about Drupal, could talk about business use cases and things that people were doing at Drupal, and obviously at the same time introduce new organizations to Drupal. So it has those kind of 2 purposes. We did a series of 4 of them, and we took that template and kind of open sourced it, so to speak, and I'm very excited to have people like MediaCurrent and the other sponsors here today carrying on this and doing them. We recently had one in Los Angeles. We've got one coming up in Boston. Entirely community driven, very keeping in sort of style of what the Drupal community is all about. So once again, from my perspective, thank you to sponsors for being able to make these types of things happen, and it's exciting to be here. So the first question some people always have, and I had to learn this myself years ago, is Global 2000. So that's, you take the rank of the world's largest organizations, you put them down, and it's the first 2,000, right? And I thought, whoops, no, that's not right at all. In fact, it's nothing like that. There's actually more than 10,000 companies in the Global 2000. So what the heck is the Global 2000? The Global 2000 is more easily thought of as everything that's not an SME or an SMB, whether you want to think of it as small to medium-sized enterprises or small to medium-sized businesses. And it is not just corporations or businesses. It is governments like the state of Georgia and our federal government. It is NGOs like a great Drupal user on the West Coast, World Vision, worldvision.org. It's a $1 billion charity that helps children in need around the world, particularly Africa, just making sure they have fresh food and water to sustain themselves. A big Drupal user like Muscular Dystrophy Association, MDA, and Comic Relief, if you're familiar with that British charity, a very big British charity, has a big event every year, also runs on Drupal, and we're very privileged to be part of those. It's something that if you're new to Drupal, by the way, how many of you are new to Drupal? Any of you at all? Just a few of you. It's a big part of what Drupal's about is being a community that not only is fun to be part of, but does great things. So anyway, starting in on thinking about what the Global 2000 companies typically have, and what they have is a broken web. In looking and speaking to these organizations, I probably meet with myself well over 200 different organizations a year. This pattern keeps coming up, which is that organizations started maybe 15 years ago with their original web. They built the corporate web. They built it perhaps on Vignette, the tool that state of Georgia was using, or something like Interwoven. What now are more legacy systems, different types of systems that publish content like you published a newspaper. You have a page, you publish to that page. You had long workflows. Sometimes it would take 2 to 3 weeks to get a new piece of content posted to the web. But of course, that's not the web today, right? We're in a dynamic web, and people have a blog post, they hit submit, they want the thing to appear right now. In addition to that, these systems were complex, and it was difficult to introduce smaller websites that might be an event website or a product website. And so organizations would go out and use different technologies for different websites. And we see, a good example, the House of Representatives, a little over 2 years ago, had 25 different systems that the reps used. So you'd come in and, it was just chaos. It was a real problem for security because CIOs can't keep track of all these different technologies and make sure all of them are up to date from a security perspective. And for a CMO, it's a real problem of branding because they all look different. So the House of Representatives decided before the election 2 years ago, in a great partnership that we at Acquia, and together with Phase 2, was mentioned earlier today, built a platform for all the new reps for the House of Representatives. And so when the 94, I think that's the number, new reps were sworn in 2 years ago, they all had a Drupal site waiting for them when they started. One technology, consistent look and feel, and secure. The House of Reps had gone through a situation the year before that at the State of the Union when President Obama was speaking that 6 of the sites were hacked, from overseas. It's a big time to do that, and they wanted to eliminate that issue as a risk. So anyway, the web is broken. It's full of disparate systems, duplication of content, a nightmare for CMOs of trying to think, I've got content over here, I've got content over there, and then when they want to find it, sometimes they can't find it. Lots of static content, talked about that already. The web is changing, it's different, and it's too expensive to manage. That's the state of the world still today. So what do these organizations want? They want to be able to have a single repository, a single place that feeds their information out to multiple channels. When the web was built 15 years ago, and the systems that were built to support that, they didn't have the vision of different channels of distribution. Mobile devices, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, product sites. That wasn't part of the vision of these products, but that is what these organizations need. Help me to distribute my content wherever I might want it. Let me repurpose it. Let me pick the right content. And don't make it a nightmare for me to repurpose that content. So if I've got a nice, beautiful web page that sits on a desktop or a notebook, don't make it impossible for me to display that on a mobile device, as you heard in our keynote presentation this morning. In addition to that, I need to have a system, as I talked about a little bit, that scales from the simple to the complex and from small to large. And those things are not mutually inclusive. There are lots of small sites that are very complex. In particular case, might have a marketing site that does some gamification around a certain event to try and get some customer engagement. We'll talk about a little bit, a good example of that General Motors did. But that might be quite complex even though it's a small site. You might have very large sites, a lot of corporate sites that we work with. Zynga.com, Zynga's business, as you know, is games on Facebook. Their primary technology is there. They use their corporate site as an analyst relations site, as an information site, but it's not something that if you're a Zynga user, you go hang out at Zynga.com generally. Maybe announcements about new products and things like that. But it's a relatively simple site, even though it is a large Drupal site. So simple to complex, small to large, has not been something in the history of the web that's been able to do with a single tool. And you can see where I'm going. Why Drupal starts to address these things and deliver what the Global 2000 organizations want. Of course, it all starts with open source, and I use a term called open source 2.0. What I mean by that is when open source first came out, it was about superior economics. Products like Linux took other existing technologies, operating systems, in this particular case Unix, commoditized it, created better economics, but effectively providing similar functionality. That was true as well about MySQL. Today's open source is different. Not only does it provide better economics, but it also provides better functionality and better innovation. So open source 2.0 is much more about improvements on the technology, and in the case of open source content management systems, including Drupal, this is a fundamental reason why they're starting to grow so fast. In fact, the 3 largest used content management systems on the planet, who have a vast majority of the market share, are all open source. So Drupal, Joomla, WordPress, the three of the systems that Nikhil talked about just a moment ago. Relative to what these organizations need, though, and want, is there is a tremendous shift to something called content services. To be able to have a repository that serves up your content to all these different channels we talked about, there are some fundamental differences in architecture that have to take place. It's no longer, a monolithic system that you do everything in that system. Today, you need to be able to say, wherever my content is, I might actually want to have a native mobile app on an iOS or Android platform accessing that data. That native app isn't built, in the technology that is that monolithic technology, but it needs to be able to get the same content. That's concept of content servicing, and that's through different types of, this technical term up here, RESTful services. It's a notion of service-oriented architecture. And Drupal, in fact, has a modern service-oriented architecture that is its competitive advantage to be able to deliver this type of capability. In addition to that, there's a fundamental notion and a difference in the way that Drupal works than other providers. Henry Ford's greatest contribution, anybody want to take a guess at it, to the world? Wasn't your Ford Mustang, but pardon me? I couldn't hear it. So. Oh, the car. There we go. Mustang. Yeah, that is a Mustang. It was a great contribution, but it wasn't. But it's mass production. That's absolutely right. Henry Ford invented the, mass production line. And before that, automobiles were not accessible by everybody. And when he created the mass production line, all of a sudden, automobiles were something everybody could do. You could do it faster, cheaper, better than you could before. And that's what Drupal does to building websites that's different than previous technologies as well. You used to build websites. You spent a lot of time coding. You spent a lot of time, you had to know Java or PHP or something else. Today, with Drupal, you snap things together. It's modular, it's componentized. It's the same concept as taking things on an assembly line and putting them together. There are over 16,000 modules for Drupal. It's a challenge to always know what they are, but that's why the Drupal ecosystem is around there to help you as an end user figure out what those are. It's a key part of, as well, what we do at Acquia is helping people understand, okay, how do you navigate all the various choices as your guide? So one of the things that, as well, that's really key, that's a differentiator and an important reason why Drupal is such a popular and chosen tool is that today's web experiences encompass social or community, they encompass content, and they encompass commerce or e-commerce. And increasingly so, those 3 things are being bound together. And a good example of this is what Warner Music does. Big Drupal user. They have artist sites, all of their artists. One of my favorites is Bruno Mars is a Warner Music site built in Drupal. And they obviously are doing content, different things about Bruno. They have some downloads and other things, but they also create community in that same place. Bruno Mars fan club comes in there, and people can exchange ideas about Bruno Mars. So social and content coming together. And of course, today, music industry is in turmoil. They also want to be able to monetize that. So they offer you a chance to buy Bruno Mars merchandise, posters and scarves and all sorts of things to, get together. And all of that experience is one experience with e-commerce and content and community coming together. But traditional systems, and this is very true of even things that are very considered modern, like Jive, who had an IPO earlier this year. If you want to use Jive and you want to have content, you're getting another system and you're plugging them together. I saw a white paper yesterday from a proprietary vendor, Sitecore, and they said, oh, do social with Sitecore. All you have to do is attach Telligent. And it's not the same user experience. They're different technologies. It's not consistent. Doesn't provide a nice unified web experience in the way that Drupal can by combining content, community, and commerce, something we call the 3 C's. So, getting into really what the topic was about, which is where is Drupal used. I'm going to give you some examples, and hopefully this is useful for you and exciting. Cartier, the famous French luxury brands provider, is using Drupal for e-commerce sites. There's a major trend in e-commerce, and it's a change from things historically. The first e-commerce plays were much more about, throw up a catalog, sell something online, and people would buy it. Small descriptions of what you wanted, and you just did that online. It's now changing where organizations want to create an immersive experience to make their online shopping in many ways as rewarding as shopping in a store, or in some cases, even better, because you have the opportunity to provide a lot more information, a lot more context around those items. To do that and accomplish that, you have to be able to merge the content and the commerce pieces. You have to have rich content with commerce. And this is where Drupal's winning. Just last year, there were the beta of Drupal Commerce was released by another partner of ours and a big part of the Drupal ecosystem, the Commerce guys. To date, they've had over 16,000 implementations of Drupal Commerce. I mean, it's a very fast-growing, very highly successful thing. In Drupal 6, there's a product called UberCart used. There are hundreds of thousands of deployments of UberCart in the market, creating a rich, immersive experience for people working on e-commerce. Another big user in the southeast here of Drupal is Florida Hospitals, based out of Orlando, Florida. It's the country's largest outpatient care system. It's massive. They do more outpatient care than any other hospital system in the country, based on, in fact, making it easier for you to find them and to work with them. And they do a lot of that through the web. They don't think of themselves as a traditional hospital provider. In fact, they have a really own in-house design team that creates the experiences on the web that they have. They've gone through and they've linked up location-based systems with Drupal, so that if you're traveling around and you need some health care and you guys say, hey, where do I find my closest hospital? You can get onto a mobile device right then and there and say, take me to the nearest Florida hospital. It's an amazing experience. It's an experience that you can go using Drupal's unique capabilities I'll talk about later to scale that experience from a desktop through to different types of mobile devices, whether that's a pad device or a mobile phone. Very, very compelling. Mercedes-Benz, moving across the ocean to Germany. Mercedes-Benz has created a community site. The community is a particular target group of their customers, 25 to 40, I think, is the age range, people who want sports cars, and they use it as kind of a focus group. They use Drupal as a focus group to understand how are our new designs being perceived, what do our customers think, what should the future look like, and they're creating a dialogue with their customers like they've never had before. It's difficult for manufacturers in a B2C world to have a dialogue direct with a consumer. But with products like Drupal and its social capabilities, it's really, really very straightforward. Mercedes-Benz won an award for this site in Europe as a really, really progressive site. It's very cool if you get a chance to go out and take a look at it. Moving to the west coast of the US, one of the technical users, or high-tech users of Drupal is Intel. And there are dozens of these organizations. Intel was one of the first who builds their developer communities around Drupal. So similar to Mercedes in the sense that it's about communities, but a different target audience. In this case, it's educated ecosystem providers. It's the people who are building applications on top of Intel platforms who need reference kits and different types of information, documents, they need to download things. This is a more document-centric extranet that Intel has built and been so successful that they are moving all of their partner communities, all of their external extranet sites over to Drupal. I mentioned earlier gamification, something that Turner Sports has done a lot of actually here in Atlanta with some of their NASCAR sites. It's kind of cool. They also do it with March Madness on demand. They have Drupal that they use for that. This particular photo comes from China actually, where General Motors in China does some gamification with Drupal to try and create a brand image around what is General Motors to an organization, China, or a country, sorry, that's not that familiar with what is the General Motors brand. And good news for them is they get to start from scratch in that country. You don't have to deal with all the legacy of General Motors in this country. And they do that through creating these kind of quaint little things. And this happens to be an application that you go in and you do kind of a personality profile. And it takes your personality profile, comes back and says, hey, this is the kind of person you are. And they have these nice little neat icons that Asians love. This particular one I particularly like because you're a very charming person. The opposite sex might love you at first sight for your free spirit. And at the end it says, keep this in mind. Don't dump your friends, though, when you find a significant other. So it's kind of fun. It's a play, and it's something that's helping General Motors build their brand in Asia. Coming back to the high-tech community, this one is a support portal. It comes from Symantec. It's actually one that's been around probably as long as anything in the high-tech community, where it's a great use of Drupal. It's very compelling. There are almost just under 300,000 registered users in this community. If you're familiar with building sites and you've done things, managing and scaling to 300,000 registered users is no small feat. They're not all simultaneous, obviously, but it is something that Drupal deals with on a regular basis. I'll talk about another challenging, simultaneous user use case a little bit later. So this Symantec site called connect.symantec.com, if you want to take a look at it, it just went through a small redesign. It looks a little bit different than this now. Has just short of 1 million documents, 1 million contributions have done, 95% of which have been done by the community, not by Symantec employees. And the community in their case are both end users as well as partners. They have a reward system where if you're contributing information, you can get rewards and special treats from Symantec. Sometimes it's just being acknowledged for the fact that you're an expert. Sometimes it will be, discounts and nice things off of Symantec products. But in their case, it's not only provides a higher level of customer satisfaction because it's faster response times on the customer issues, it also is dramatically, let's say, not lowered, but maintained or it's kept their support costs low as their business has grown. Back across the pond again to France. So we had Germany before, now we're in France. This is Unilever. I'm sure everybody knows the Unilever brand, big sort of Dutch-English firm with consumer packaged goods. Lots of different consumer packaged goods, each with their own brand. This site is called Ma Vie en Couleur, in English, My Life in Colors, and it's designed for caregivers, people who are responsible for the cooking and the cleaning and beauty and things. A little bit focused towards, I'd say, women, but not exclusively. And you can see the colors, so there's a cultural change here, different design, and I think that's an important part of looking at these different sites is the separation of the design from the functionality in Drupal allows you to create your own experience. It's very powerful. What I love about this site, by the way, is that it actually allows, once again, a B2C brand, Unilever, to engage with their customers, which they've never been able to do before, There's some fun things out there. You can look up recipes, you can learn how to do things unrelated to the Unilever brand, so that's part of the community element of it. But in addition, they have, you can't really read it up here, but at the end it's Côté Marque, which means their brands, and you can go out and learn about their brands, what does Unilever have, and get coupons. You can then take those coupons as a registered user, so each coupon is personalized, go and use the coupon at a store to buy that product. And once you've bought that product, Unilever gets the information back about your buying patterns. They're anonymous, but they start to learn how to interact and personalize information so that they can provide better service and better products to their customers than they have before. Of course, hopping back and forth across the ponds, we start to deal with global brands, like in this case, New York Stock Exchange. There's an interesting corollary in the New York Stock Exchange adoption of Drupal, which is that a couple of years ago when they were actually deploying some new sites, they'd chosen a proprietary system, now owned by a big company who's based on the West Coast with red letters in their name, and they're famous for databases. So that organization had received almost $10 million from the New York Stock Exchange to build out a new web presence. And over that 2 years, they'd yet to actually launch their first site. And a new chief digital officer came in. Obviously, the project was in trouble. He looked at it, was making a determination, should we continue with that technology or should we try something new? He asked some folks, one of the questions in the analysis was, how long would it take you to add a new menu item? And the answer came back, we could probably do that in 2 or 3 weeks. And having experience with Drupal, knowing things better, he said, oh, I know I can do that in 2 to 3 hours with Drupal. The innovation curve, the ability to innovate in the product itself, much less external innovation that's adding new features, was compelling enough to him that he went to the board of the New York Stock Exchange and said, I want to throw this out and I want to start all over and I'll do it with Drupal. And I promise you that within 30 days, I'll have the first sites up. And indeed, he delivered on that. And today, New York Stock Exchange and Euronext going global with Drupal, different languages for the different markets, stock markets across the world. I think they have more than 30 Drupal sites up now in that 2 years, as opposed to the 0 they'd had with their proprietary predecessor. This slide is very messy, and I don't expect you to understand a single thing on it, so apologies for that. However, the key thing is it's from Verizon, a great global 2000 company. Verizon has implemented an intranet, so it's not just external sites that we've been sharing until now, but it's also internal sites where Drupal is used. They have an intranet that serves Verizon Wireless, more than 90,000 people at Verizon Wireless, something that also Capgemini, the large system integrator, their intranet is also based on Drupal. And I just found out a couple of weeks ago that the big Swiss bank, UBS, has a 100,000 person intranet based on Drupal. So talk about scaling, common simultaneous users, a big thing, a big problem. Clearly, Drupal can scale to the needs of these global 2000 organizations. In Verizon's particular case, they had an intranet that was not, people were not using, and they were struggling to actually get engagement. So the big measure for them was going to be how fast could you get people to engage, and they had some phenomenal statistics in terms of the growth of that intranet. In the first 3 months, they went from 0 to over 20,000 users, and as I mentioned, they're now up to over 90,000. So successful that they're taking the same technology, even though they're technically different companies, probably not something I certainly didn't know, and most people don't. Verizon Wireless is actually a joint venture between Verizon and Vodafone of Europe, as opposed to Verizon Wired. So it's a little bit tricky, but Verizon Wired is going to implement the same technology. And it's tricky because they can't just take the components and reuse them because they're different companies. So it's not the ideal situation, but guess what? Because it's open source, a lot of this stuff is freely available, and they're going to be able to take the ideas and move them across. And last but not least, in terms of some of the examples, yesterday actually I was in San Diego visiting Qualcomm. Anybody not know who Qualcomm is? I can take a, you know, they apparently make something like 70% of their revenue through chips, what you know them for. They build really a lot of the mobile chips that go into your phones. They also make 30% of their revenue off of, believe it or not, intellectual property, you know, granting licenses to the patents that they have. And they have an entire wall in their lobby. It's these pieces of paper, and you don't really know what they are, because from afar it just looks like design, some art, these white pieces of paper with frames. And you get close and you walk up and it's one of their patents. So here's an organization really, really, really believing in intellectual property and proprietary nature of things and making 30% of their multi-billion dollars a year in revenue off of intellectual property, who's standardized on open source. And you know, if you're familiar with it, a lot of the fears about people adopting open source are often like, boy, you know, there's things wrong with the intellectual property ownership, the security, this and that. You know, I loved it when Nikhil said earlier in the presentation, his presentation, you know, DHS is using Drupal now. How can you get more secure than that? And in this case, Qualcomm is using Drupal. How can you get more proprietary than that? It's really hard. But they realized the advantages of using Drupal, and it's not just their extranets or their communities, their corporate marketing. It's Drupal everywhere at Qualcomm. Some of it with their own Drupal expertise hosted by them, some of it with their, you know, with their partners, their agency partners who built it and hosted elsewhere. But they've been extremely successful at Drupal, and they remain very committed to staying with Drupal. And I used the NVIDIA comment before as well. NVIDIA is in the process of moving from just their community sites, moving all of their corporate marketing sites over to Drupal as well. So what is this about? It's about predominance, and this is just some examples of the places where Drupal is very dominant, but it's growing very, very fast in many other markets. There's 130 nations around the world using it. Don't ask me why, but recently it was on the website for Côte d'Ivoire, also known as the Ivory Coast. Their sites are on Drupal. I ended up there by doing some research, and I thought, wow, there you go. So around the world, I lived in Australia for 10 years. I'm very proud that the Australian Prime Minister's website is on Drupal. The French Prime Minister's website is on Drupal as well, and it's part of the many different government organizations. I'm going to walk you through some of these other names, who some of these folks are. This happens to be an Acquia slide. These are all of just our customers, but limited. But I like the way the slide presents it across different verticals. So, you know, in media, I love to talk about the fact that both Fox News and Al Jazeera use Drupal, different ends of the spectrum. In the entertainment world, you know, this is an area where really, if you're a Robbie Williams fan or if you're a Paramore fan, you're out accessing Drupal. You know, MichaelJackson.com, Britney Spears, all Drupal. NBC, Universal, did their mobile site this Olympics on Drupal. In fact, they weren't the only Olympics site on Drupal. So did Thomson Reuters in media, and so did the Associated Press. All built out their Olympic sites with Drupal. In the public sector, I've talked about a number of these already. Going into higher ed, this is an area where Drupal is really, really very, very omnipresent. I was just listening to some folks from Georgia Tech in the back of the room earlier today. Georgia Tech moving all of their sites over to Drupal, as is Georgetown, as is Harvard. And I like to contrast there. If you're a West Coast person, Stanford's on Drupal, and then you're East Coast person, you know, Harvard's on Drupal. I'm more proud, if I'm from the Midwest, the fact that the University of Michigan and my alma mater, University of Wisconsin, are also on Drupal. Going into some of the more lesser known areas, but where Drupal is really present, I talked about high tech a lot. LinkedIn, Twitter, eBay, I mentioned Intel and Symantec, all run their communities on Drupal. In the area of pharma and healthcare, this is probably the fastest growing area. We see more growth here than others. Johnson & Johnson, a big pharmaceutical, Pfizer, both moving hundreds. Johnson & Johnson has today well over 800 sites on Drupal. Pfizer's planning to have well over 500. They're doing different product sites. You may say, how does someone have 800 sites? They have product sites for everything they do as they move their business processes from traditional paper-based methods to everything being online. They'll create a new website for a new product, or in the pharma industry, which of course is highly regulated, or through approvals, they have all kinds of other clinical trial information or product recall information, all done on their websites. In the case of Johnson & Johnson, all in Drupal. But not just those brands, McKesson, Amgen. I was also at Genentech earlier this week. Genentech's part of Roche, going to Drupal in a big way. Another exciting area is financial services. It's both insurance companies, which I don't know, something happened in the water this year in the insurance companies, what they're drinking, because I know of at least 15 insurance companies, major multinational insurance companies like Liberty Mutual and Royal Sun Alliance, Aegon up here, the Dutch insurance company, who've decided to invest in Drupal in a big way. But not just those, the really, really guys that make proprietary decisions all the time, the financial services companies, the banks, people like UBS that I mentioned earlier, Société Générale in France, but even Fidelity. And Fidelity, for those of us who've been software vendors for a long time, and I've been in business, I'm celebrating my 32nd year in software. Fidelity is a joke for vendors. It's the hardest company to sell to in technology, bar none. They're really, really brutal. But they're also known for having amazing technology. And Fidelity has stepped up and started to really deploy Drupal in many big ways. But in addition to that, other brands that fall outside of these industries, DuPont, a favorite of ours, Levi's. Levi's been using Drupal for a long time. And if you're from the Northeast, you'll know the brand Irving Oil of Canada. So just to kind of summarize then and wrap up some of the how and reiterating the why of people using Drupal. Here's a great example of the innovation of the Drupal community and why and how people leverage it. So Pinterest is now the third largest social network in the world, and we know that government is not Pinterest. Thanks again, Nikhil, for that. But Pinterest hit 10 million users in February. In the world of the web, that's a critical mass. It came from nowhere. It's called the speed of the web. Now, proprietary products trying to figure out what they're going to do with Pinterest integration, of course, then start to put that in their roadmap. It says, oh, Pinterest is important. We'll put that in our roadmap. It'll be in our product in 2014. That's a traditional development cycle. Well, in the Drupal world, because of the way that modules and things are created, the Pinterest module became available, or a Pinterest module, there's probably a few of them today, became available in March. And in April, there were 15 sites using Pinterest. This isn't going out to your site and hitting click, pin this picture on this site to Pinterest. Now, this is taking information off of Pinterest, integrating your own website, which a lot of retail brands do in terms of trying to popularize and leverage what Pinterest does. But for those folks using enterprises, it's also really important to understand what's the back-end integration story for Drupal. And it is really, I've never seen anything like this as quite as powerful as, and I come from an industry that's known as enterprise application integration. Some of you might have heard of a company called Web Methods, and we built a whole business off of integrating back ends of systems. But because of the way Drupal's architected, it's really easy to integrate, and the community is very fast to build integrations to various types of systems to create a complete digital marketing experience. So whether it's CRM or Salesforce automation or marketing automation that you're trying to integrate to, or things like user-generated content networks, LinkedIn and Facebook, it's extremely easy to pull that information together, publish out to them, or work with them in terms of creating an enterprise system. And all that is possible because of this notion of open source and the way that Drupal gets developed. Historically, and I spent most of those 32 years of my life in proprietary software companies, you built your requirements, and then you went out and you built the product itself, and then you tested it, and then you released it, and it was done in sequential mode, similar to, say, a batch processing. And I did start my career with punch paper cards on batch processing systems. Mind you, they were in the cloud, in Seattle, but it was Boeing Computer Services, and the year was, well, a long time ago. But that batch processing is still the way that a lot of innovation happens, as opposed to innovation in the Drupal community and innovation in open source, where there's nodes and pods of innovation happening all the time in the creation of these modules that you snap in, and that's networked. It's the analogy to today's network computer environments, so where things can happen remotely and at different paces and different speeds. That is really just a better approach, and a better approach that's tailored to whatever your form factor or whatever your end result is. So not restricting you to this notion of here's a page and everything is a page, we're going to publish it. If you want to publish out to these different channels, grabbing the concept of Drupal's components and taking those components and reusing those components in these different factors without re-architecting your entire solution. So we're very proud of what Drupal is, you know, from a community perspective, and for those of you that are members of the community here, in fact, we like to consider all of you a member of the community, whether you're a member of the community on the agency side or whether you're a community on the end user side. It's really exciting to be here. We believe that Drupal will continue to grow. There's a lot of great things coming out in Drupal 8, fantastic improvements. One of my favorite ones is something called Spark, which we at Acquia are very involved in, which we think will leapfrog the user experience, the authoring experience you have with Drupal, whether that's on a mobile device or on a conventional computing device. So with that, I've got a few minutes for questions. If you ever want to get a hold of me, these are my details. Hopefully you can read them. So if there's any questions. Okay, not too big. Well, I like big questions. I like small questions. Someone once said that, you know, it's a lot easier for us if the questions are simple, because then we look smart when we give the answer.
Well, it's about how Drupal gets developed. There's been discussions on Drupal.org about supporting, incenting, or compensating maintainers for innovating modules. And now, I'm a small company. I don't have the wherewithal that you do with that with. So I would like to be able to take my credit card and send a module maintainer to innovate something that could go back into the contrib module. So is there anything Acquia can do, or what's your thoughts on that?
So the question was, is there a way to sponsor, I think it's the term we use, sponsor maintainers to help them, you know, innovate further on their modules. It does happen today. The mechanism is a bit more cumbersome for you to do it in smaller amounts. I mean, we actually do a lot of it in Acquia in terms of, right now there's an effort to get views, which is the most widely used contributed module, put that into core Drupal. And Earl Miles, who's the maintainer of that views module, made a proposal to the Drupal Association and said, if I get sponsored to the tune of, and I forget what the number is, I can do this work and I'll get it into core. And in fact, that's something that we at Acquia and many of the other Drupal agencies have been involved in sponsoring. Unfortunately, today, we've talked about this, there isn't a mechanism for people to contribute via credit card or PayPal or something like that to individual maintainers to sponsor initiatives. But I would encourage you to, create a dialogue. I can introduce you to some of the folks. We have a team at Acquia called the Office of the CTO. It's basically Dries' group, and they sit aside from the commercial part of Acquia. It's a group of about 10 people who are involved just in community things, building a lot of things, but just contributing to Drupal. That group is probably a better place for me to steer you to say, hey, what can we do here and how can we make that happen? Before lunch, yeah, go ahead.
How do you compare Drupal to the other CMSs, Unilever,
So the question is, how do I compare Drupal to the other open source CMSs or e-commerce providers like Magento? At Acquia, we actually spend most of our time comparing Drupal to the proprietary CMSs from Adobe, Sitecore, SDL. So we spend a lot more time being able to compare those, and I'm much more of an expert at that because those are the plays, that's the area where we as Acquia play, and we play in helping these organizations and ensuring that Drupal grows in that sector. But without being too direct on how we do think about WordPress or Joomla, Joomla is an interesting thing because it has quite broad adoption, but it doesn't, unlike WordPress and Drupal, doesn't have a company associated with it at any level. So the community is quite fragmented. There isn't a single leader of the community, and we don't believe that Joomla, we at Acquia don't believe Joomla will be a relevant system in a few years' time. WordPress, on the other hand, is very vibrant and growing quite rapidly. It's different than the Drupal community in that most of the core contributors to WordPress are employed by Automatic, which is the founder of WordPress's company. So it's a very different kind of community. It's one thing that's really fundamentally important, we think, because of the pace of innovation that can happen in the Drupal community associated with community being much larger. We get excited by that. We think that if you take a look at Linux and Drupal have more in common than WordPress does with those communities. WordPress is a very capable system. A lot of organizations, a great example is General Electric, recently decided to go completely open source for their web properties and are going to use WordPress for their blogs and Drupal for their websites. And that's typically how we think about WordPress and Drupal. In fairness to those of you who use WordPress or consider it, it does do some CMS work. It's not just a blogging platform, but its heritage is blogging. We don't, at Acquia, don't believe it has the architecture to scale to that simple to complex and small to large that Drupal does. Drupal has historically struggled at coming down to the small and the simple. We think innovations like Spark will change that and make Drupal capable to do that. We think it's going to be harder for WordPress to go to the complex and large sites. Particularly the complex. It has a lot of big sites in terms of traffic, just not very complex. Magento, on the other hand, really is an e-commerce system with very little capabilities for content. So a lot of our customers work and use Drupal in conjunction with Magento. And we actually, at Acquia, have a partnership with eBay and Magento. They run their Magento community is run on Drupal, x.com. And we're due, a lot of our customers also run Magento. So that's how I think of it. Hopefully that answers your question. So it's one more question if there is one. Yeah, over here. Is there a danger outside of security concerns around increasing homogeneity of the web in terms of platforms for the web? Actually, I hope, at least from my perspective, I like to use an analogy of databases and ERP systems, where there's really only upside. And I'll give you an example. It does create systems that are dominant, Oracle and SAP being the names that come to mind. But when I started my career, people built databases. A lot of databases were custom databases, just as something like 70% of websites today, through our crawler information, are custom websites. They're not things that you can recognize as a true CMS. And those databases eventually, people were maintaining different kinds of databases. There were great companies in database. Cullinet was one out of Boston. Through a very brilliant entrepreneur named John Cullinane. But still, there were a lot of custom databases, and the relational database came along, and there were a few different vendors that were vying. There's a company called Relational Technology, Inc., and a company called Relational Systems, Inc. Those are the two leading players. Relational Systems, Inc. renamed themselves to Oracle. Relational Technology, Inc. renamed themselves to Ingress. And eventually, people converged and standardized on the fact that we're not going to build databases anymore. It doesn't make sense because relational technology is superior to what was there before. I think it's that same analogy in the web world. I think, we're growing. There's been Interwoven and Vignette, and they've had a piece of the pie. But as the web's grown, now there is the possibility to be, it's a better technology, and it's something that homogeneity is actually an improvement for organizations, because it is more secure because you're maintaining fewer different systems. It's more consistent in terms of the skill sets. And the biggest problem large enterprises have is they have this diversity of systems inside the organization. They have to have the talent to maintain them all too, and that's hard. That's really hard. They've got 30 different systems. They have to have people that know all 30 of them. If they have one system, they get to share that talent. It provides great career progress for those folks too, because they can move around organizations and do different things. So that's my perspective. I think there's only upside. Maybe there is some other things. So I'm sorry, no more time for questions, but I'll be around most of the rest of the day. I have to step out later. I'll be back for drinks later tonight too, so hopefully I'll get a chance to meet you. Thank you.